Let's talk about this with Gareth Porter. He's a historian and investigative journalist who joins us in the studios here in the capital, Tehran. Well, Gareth Porter, welcome. I see that you came with your book, Manufactured Crisis. I want you to tell me more about that, and of course, it's quite appropriate that this coincides with this recent report that I just read about the U.S. praising Iran on its cooperation.
Well, my book, Manufactured Crisis, was published in February, and I've worked on it really for the past several years because I have been focusing on the question of whether the accusations against Iran that really began very intensively around 2008 and have continued ever since were really based on fact or fiction. And with the suspicion that it was indeed fiction rather than fact. And my book documents very heavily on the basis of a sort of historical in-depth investigation of the Iranian program and, more importantly, the United States intervention from very early on in that program, back to 1983, how the manufactured crisis really is the result of the United States and Israel working together to create a kind of false intelligence dossier, really, about the Iranian program, claiming that there was a covert nuclear weapons program between 2001 and 2003, and then charging that even beyond that, there are these intelligence reports and documents claiming that Iran was continuing to work on nuclear weapons. And I go back to 1983, as I say, to point out that the United States really began to try to strangle the Iranian nuclear program in the cradle, as it were, beginning in that year, despite the fact that Iran was really only interested in a very modest peaceful nuclear program, which would not even involve the independent capability to enrich uranium. And that the fact the United States tried to prevent them from having even that modest program forced them to make a choice between giving up a nuclear program entirely or having their own independent enrichment capability. And then that became then the beginning of Iran's search for the technology to enrich uranium. As soon as the United States saw that happening, which of course happened almost immediately, they then began to treat that as prima facie evidence that Iran was indeed trying to get nuclear weapons. And then it was under the Bush administration that you had what I refer to as the manufactured crisis being planned, particularly between John Bolton, then Undersecretary of State in the administration, and the Israeli government to essentially create a set of documents that would indict Iran as pursuing nuclear weapons. And I show in the book that the documents on which this has been based, which suddenly appeared mysteriously in 2004, can be traced back to the Mujahedin-e Khalq, giving them to German intelligence, and the MEK undoubtedly got them from Israel. I document that connection between the MEK and Israel, that the MEK had been laundering intelligence for the Israelis for years. And I show that there is strong evidence that these, I would say absolutely convincing evidence that the documents were fabricated, showing the contradictions that really give that away in the book. So that's the essence of the story that I tell in this.
Well, of course, there's lots of details behind everything that you're saying, but one thing I didn't catch, or perhaps I'm going to ask you now to present as some examples of how this has become a manufactured crisis. I noticed that reading on some of the experts from your book, you referred to the Iran-Iraq War back in 1988, how the U.S. State and Defense Departments falsely have said that both sides used chemical weapons. And I'm asking this, and I want you to relate, as you did in the book, about what Iran's leader has said, along with, obviously, Imam Khomeini, previous leader, of how Iran has a fatwa against the use of nuclear weapons, how that relates together.
Well, this is an absolutely critical part of the book because, as I think everyone listening to this program undoubtedly knows, the United States has been dismissing the anti-nuclear weapons fatwa that has been put forward by the current Supreme Leader, and basically said that this is simply propaganda. But what I have shown in the book is that this is certainly not plausible, because during the Iran-Iraq War, I show that, and again, this is well known to your listeners, but is unknown in the Western world, that Iran refused to, or failed to respond to retaliate against Iraq's chemical weapons war against Iran during the imposed war from 1981 to 1988. And the only reason that one can plausibly offer for that failure to retaliate is that there was indeed a fatwa against chemical weapons by Khomeini during that war. So that makes the fatwa against nuclear weapons not just plausible, but entirely credible, because this shows that the Islamic jurisprudence that was exercised by the Supreme Leader was indeed the crucial factor in shaping Iran's policy toward weapons of mass destruction. And this is a point that is totally absent from the political discourse in the United States and the West on this issue.
Why do you think that's absent? Is it because that you think Americans perhaps would not buy the obviously heavy significance that this is placed by Iran's leader, that they would never use WMDs?
Well, I think it's a bit complicated. On one hand, I think that there's government propaganda. As you indicated earlier, I show that there was very heavy propaganda at the end of the war, the Iran-Iraq War, by the U.S. government to suggest that Iran had used chemical weapons, which was entirely untrue. And that has obviously shaped opinion in the United States to a great extent. I think there's another factor that is in play here, and that is that in the West, there's a great deal of difficulty understanding that religious, ethical values could actually make a difference in policy toward something like chemical weapons or nuclear weapons. And I think that's a failure to grasp an elementary characteristic of the Islamic regime in Iran.
You talked about that huge cache of information that came out in 2004. Again, falsification of intelligence as it came out to be in this so-called laptop. Tell us more about that, because that was very crucial in shaping some of the politicians that are in the White House right now, including the President Obama.
It is indeed a crucial factor. It was blown up beginning in 2008, particularly by the fact that the International Atomic Energy Agency essentially embraced these documents, called them credible in their reports, although they had no evidence, in fact, that they were authentic. And El-Baradei, the Director General of the IAEA at that point, continued to reiterate that the agency had not established the authenticity of those documents, insisted that they should not be used as evidence in regard to Iran's nuclear program. Nevertheless, that became the narrative that really dominated the news coverage of Iran's nuclear program, the nuclear issue, for the years since then. And the problem with that, of course, is that the laptop documents, as I suggested earlier, really had a history that indicates clearly that they were not what they were made out to be. The Mujahedin-e Khalq obviously is not a reliable organization, and I show in the book that German intelligence, the BND intelligence agency, which received the documents from Mujahedin-e Khalq, informed a senior German civil official named Carsten Voigt, who I quote in the book, told him that the MEK had indeed turned the documents over to the BND, and indicated to him that they did not regard that source as reliable. They said it was a doubtful source. So they clearly were concerned about the United States using those documents to base its policy on. But of course, the Bush administration paid no attention to that warning, as they paid no attention to the earlier BND warning against using the curveball testimony, which then was discredited as a complete lie in regard to the Iraq War.
Well, you know, as your book appropriately is called Manufactured Crisis, the manufacturing of this crisis with the different examples that you've portrayed in your book, what becomes a problem is the fact that you have an agency like the IAEA endorsing some of them, like this supposed laptop, but they're supposed to be a neutral party. How does that come about?
Well, and in fact, of course, part of the problem is that the IAEA did in fact have a legitimate reputation for being neutral, independent, a technical agency, because Mohammed al-Baradei had been the Director General, and he had actually stood up to the Bush administration in regard to the rationale that it had put forward for the war in Iraq. He pointed out, standing up before the UN Security Council, that one of the major pieces of evidence that had been put forward by the Bush administration to justify that invasion was in fact forged. That's the Nigergate document. So that's why I think the IAEA had such a reputation. And the problem is that beginning in 2008, there was a shift within the agency in which al-Baradei really lost his control, in effect, over the content of their reports. And Ali Heinonen, who was then the head of the Safeguards division of the agency, basically gained the power to define the approach that the IAEA would take towards those documents, and, as I say, gave them this credibility, which they should not have had. I don't believe that al-Baradei really had changed his view of the documents. I think that for very complicated political reasons, he was pulling back from his role in determining what the position of the agency would be towards the documents. As I say, Ali Heinonen was really gaining ascendancy within the organization.
Well, here we are, 2013, the landmark deal that was signed, and of course we're looking at how talks have progressed. And my question to you, if you can answer this pretty quickly since we're running very short of time, is the fact that it appears that the U.S. is going against Israel's wishes. And I keep looking at the cover of your book when I see Netanyahu. And it seems like there's a rift now because of this. How sincere do you think the P5+1, in particular the U.S., is when it comes down to Iran's nuclear file being solved, especially given the fact that we're looking at a July deadline, whether it's going to be met or is it going to get extended, or is there not going to be a deal at all?
Well, first of all, I think it's very clear that they're not going to achieve this agreement by July 20th. I think the Americans have pretty much made it clear that they don't intend to have a deal by July 20th. That much is clear. Whether the United States is prepared really to make a deal that is realistic is a second question, and I think that's very much unclear at this point. I'm very concerned about the fact that the United States has postured so aggressively with regard to this whole notion of breakout, demanding, in effect, not just in effect, I mean, they've pretty much made it clear that they are demanding that Iran reduce the number of centrifuges to the point where breakout, so-called breakout, would be only over 6 to 12 months, meaning Iran would only be able to have the high enriched uranium over a period of 6 to 12 months. That would be a reduction in capability for enrichment, which it seems impossible to me that Iran could agree to. And so if that posturing does in fact represent the actual position of the United States in the talks in the end, that's a deal breaker. The only question is whether the U.S. administration is capable politically of backing off that deal that they've demanded in their public posturing. I'm very worried that it's going to be difficult to do that, given the political pressures that they're under. They have not prepared public opinion at all for that kind of a deal. Maybe they can do it, but it seems to me very, very difficult.
Pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much, and it's good to see you. Gareth Porter, historian and investigative journalist, here in the studios with us with his comments, and of course your book, Manufactured Crisis, which is out now. We have had Gareth Porter on our program at Press TV previously, in which he talked about his book, but now it is out and completed. Do highly recommend buying it.